My mother-in-law handed me a glass of champagne at my own father's wake and said, very sweetly, right into my ear, he would have wanted you to celebrate with us. My father had been dead for 11 hours. The estate papers she did notarize that morning, using a signature that was not mine, were already sitting in her attorney's filing cabinet. I didn't know that yet, but I'm getting ahead of myself, and before I tell you what happened next, because I promise you, what came next was something none of them saw coming. I want to ask you something first. Where in the world are you watching this right now? What time is it there? Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. Knowing you're out there, listening to this, means more to me than I can explain. My name is Laura. I'm 29 years old. I live outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, and the story I'm about to tell you is the most painful, humiliating, and ultimately the most clarifying thing that has ever happened to me. Growing up, it was just my dad and me. My mom left when I was 4, not dramatically, not traumatically, just quietly, the way some people leave. She sent birthday cards until I was about 10, and then she didn't. My dad, whose name was Howard, worked as an HVAC technician for 30 years. He wore the same 3 flannels in rotation, drove a truck with a cracked dashboard he never fixed, and made the best scrambled eggs I have ever eaten in my life. He wasn't a man who talked a lot, but he showed up. That was the thing about him, he always showed up. We didn't have money, not the kind you notice. What we had was stable. He owned our house, a 3-bedroom ranch on a 1/4 acre in a suburb of Raleigh, outright. He'd paid it off in small extra payments over 18 years. The way he did everything, quietly and completely. He had a savings account, a modest investment portfolio he'd built through his union, and a life insurance policy he'd updated. When I turned 18 to name me as the sole beneficiary, he told me about all of it when I was 22, sitting at the kitchen table after Sunday dinner, in the same tone he used to talk about the weather. Just so you know, he said, sliding a folder across to me. This is all written down. I'm not going anywhere soon, but I want you to know where things are. I closed the folder without opening it and told him to stop being morbid. I wish I had read every page. I met my husband Theo. I'm sorry, my ex-husband, when I was 24. He was charming in the way that, looking back, I recognize as the kind of charming that covers for a lot of things. He had a laugh that could fill a room. He was the first person who made me feel, genuinely feel, like I belonged somewhere. What I didn't understand then was that belonging somewhere and belonging to someone are very different things. His family was a thing unto itself. His mother, Deb, ran the household the way some people run small corporations. Efficiently, strategically, and entirely in her own interest. His father had passed away years earlier, which meant Deb had spent the last decade consolidating her authority over her 2 sons. Theo was the younger one. His older brother Caden was cut from different cloth. Quieter, uncomfortable around his mother in a way I would later understand completely. Caden's wife, Fiona, had stopped coming to family dinners by the time I arrived on the scene. I thought it was a scheduling thing. It wasn't. Deb made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that she found me insufficient. I grew up working class. I didn't have the right last name or the right education or the right family background. I had a state school degree in accounting, a used Camry, and a father who wore flannels. Theo knew how his mother felt and chose not to address it, which I told myself was respect for me, my refusing to make me a source of conflict. It was not that. The first years of our marriage were fine in the way that a lake is fine when you don't know what's underneath it. I worked as a staff accountant at a mid-sized logistics company, got promoted twice, and by the time I was 28, was handling the books for several subsidiary accounts, with a salary that surprised me every time I saw the deposit. I was careful with money, almost obsessively so, because growing up, being careless with money was something you couldn't afford to be. My father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's in the spring. By fall, it had progressed faster than his doctors had anticipated. By winter, I was driving to Raleigh every other weekend to help him. By the following spring, I was driving every weekend. Theo came with me 3 times total. Deb, meanwhile, had started calling me more regularly. I should have thought about why. I didn't. She was warm in a way she'd never quite been before, and I was tired and scared and grateful for anyone who seemed to be in my corner. She asked questions about my father, how he was doing, what the prognosis looked like, whether he had all his affairs in order. I answered them honestly because I thought she was asking out of concern. She was not asking out of concern. My father died on a Thursday morning in March. I was with him. It was quiet, which is the only mercy I can name about that day. He went the way he'd lived, without drama, without asking for anything, just present and then not. I sat with him for a while after, and then I called Theo. Theo arrived at the hospital. So did Deb. I had not asked Deb to come. She walked in with a tray of coffee and a composed expression and said all the right things in the right order, and I was too numb to feel the wrongness of her being there until much later. The wake was held 2 days later at my father's house. My aunt had flown in from Phoenix. A few of my dad's coworkers came, Men in their 60s with thick hands and kind eyes who told me stories I had never heard before, and I was holding on to every one of them. Deb had, apparently, taken it upon herself to help organize the food. I was grateful. I told her so, and she smiled and pressed my hand, and then handed me a glass of champagne, and said my father would have wanted me to celebrate with them. Something about that didn't land right. But I was exhausted and gutted, and I set the feeling aside. 2 weeks after the funeral, I met with my father's attorney to go over the estate. He was a soft-spoken man named Mr. Burrows, who had handled my father's legal affairs for 12 years. He sat across from me in his office and opened a folder and then stopped. He looked at the documents. He looked at me. He said very carefully, "Mrs. Lara, I need to ask you about some paperwork that came through in the last 3 weeks." He slid a page across the desk. It was a quitclaim deed, transferring my father's house, the house he'd spent 18 years paying off, from his name into a revocable living trust. The trust named a single trustee and a single beneficiary. Neither of them was me. The trustee was Deborah. The beneficiary was Theo. The signature on the deed, in the line designated for my father, was dated 4 days before he died. My father had been on palliative care for 11 days by that point. He could barely hold a pen. I knew because I had watched him try to sign a birthday card for my aunt 2 weeks prior, and his hand couldn't do it. We'd laughed about it, the two of us. A short, sad laugh. The signature on that deed was not his. Mr. Burrows said, very quietly, "Before I say anything else, I want you to know that I did not prepare this document, and it did not come through this office. I drove home in a state that I don't fully have words for. I remember the road, the yellow lines, the sound of my tires on the highway. I remember thinking that I needed to be wrong. I remember hoping there was an explanation I hadn't thought of yet. There wasn't. I did not go home to our apartment. I went to my friend Priya's house. Priya has been my best friend since sophomore year of college. She is a paralegal, which turned out to be the most useful thing about that night. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything, and she listened without interrupting, which is a gift I have never fully thanked her for. When I finished, she said, "Give me an hour." In that hour, she pulled up the county property records, cross-referenced the notarization, and identified the notary's license number on the deed. Then she looked at me and said, "Lara, the notary stamp is registered to a business that shares an address with Deb's attorney." The room was very quiet for a moment. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay means you're going to do something about this." I said, "Yes, I am." I went back to the apartment that night only to get my laptop and a bag of clothes. Theo was there. He was on the couch watching something on his phone, and he looked up when I came in with a confused expression that I have thought about many times since, because I still don't know how much he knew. I want to believe he didn't know. I also know that wanting to believe something is not the same as it being true. I told him I needed some space while I was processing my dad's estate. He said, of course. He hugged me. I let him. Then I drove back to Priya's and called my father's life insurance company. And a family law attorney at 9 o'clock. At night, the estate attorney returned my call the next morning. The life insurance policy was unaffected. The deed only covered the house, and the policy beneficiary designation had not been altered because it was held separately and required my signature directly to change. My father's investment accounts were in a different category. Those required probate, and the forged deed didn't touch them. The house was the target. The house, the asset he had quietly paid off over 18 years. The thing that was supposed to be my foundation. Here is what I need you to understand about that house. I did not need it. I make good money. I could buy a house myself. But my father had paid it off in 18 years of small extra payments. And the reason he'd done that, he told me this once, unprompted, just said it out loud one evening while we were watching a game, was so that if anything ever happened to him, I would have something solid under my feet. Something no one could take. That is what they tried to take. My attorney, a woman named Ruth Ashby who works out of an office above a dry cleaner on West Morgan Street, and who I will recommend to anyone who asks me for the rest of my life, began the process immediately. She filed to invalidate the deed, based on lack of testamentary capacity. My father could not have signed that document in a legally competent state 4 days before he died, and we could prove it. The hospital records, the attending, physician's notes, the palliative care intake documentation, all of it, Ruth said quietly. This is going to be straightforward. They were not careful. They were not careful because they thought I wouldn't look. They thought I'd be too grieving, too overwhelmed, too trusting. They thought I was the girl with the used Camry and the flannel-wearing father who didn't matter. What they didn't know was that I am an accountant who spent 2 years training specifically in forensic bookkeeping. I know what fraud looks like. I know exactly which threads to pull. The notary's license was suspended within 60 days pending investigation. The deed was invalidated by the court 3 months after that. Ruth filed a separate civil suit against Deb for elder financial abuse, which in North Carolina carries both civil and criminal exposure. Here is where it gets very uncomfortable. and where I want to be honest with you about something. Theo called me 2 weeks into this process. He had found out, from his mother, not from me, what was happening. He was not angry, he was scared. He asked me if I was really going to do this, and I asked him what he thought this was. He said, "You're going to destroy my mother." I said, "Your mother forged your dead grandfather-in-law's signature to steal his house from your wife 4 days before he died. She did this while I was watching him go." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She was trying to help us. She didn't think you understood how to manage assets." I hung up. I filed for divorce the following Monday. I'm telling you about that phone call because I want you to understand something that the comments always get wrong. People hear a story like this and they want the villain to be a cartoon. They want the husband to have known everything, to have been in on it, to have been cold and scheming the whole time. The reality is more complicated. Theo, I believe, knew that his mother didn't think much of me. He probably knew she had helped in ways she shouldn't have, but I think he had spent his entire life choosing not to look directly at his mother, and when forced to look, he chose to keep not looking. That is its own kind of wrong. It's just a quieter kind. The divorce was final 7 months later. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. What we had built together in 4 years of marriage, we split. I walked out of that marriage with my savings, my retirement account, my car, and eventually, my father's house. The civil suit settled out of court. I was advised by Ruth not to discuss the specific terms, and I'm going to respect that advice. What I will tell you is that Deb's attorney reached out to initiate settlement talks within 2 weeks of the elder financial abuse suit being formally filed, and I will tell you that the terms were, in Ruth's words, more than fair. The house is mine. I rent it out now, to a retired couple who water the small garden in the backyard, and who called me last spring to tell me the azaleas my dad planted were blooming. I drove out to see them. I sat in my car in front of that house for probably 20 minutes. I thought about my dad at that kitchen table, pushing a folder across to me, telling me to just know where things are. I wish I had read every page. But I read all of them now. I read everything now. I want to ask you something before you go. And I mean it when I say I've thought about how to phrase this. A lot of people, when they hear this story, don't know what to do with the mother-in-law. She didn't cause my father's illness. She didn't make him die. She just watched me grieve and made a move she thought I wouldn't catch. And my ex-husband, he didn't forge a signature. He just loved his mother more than he loved his wife, or more than he loved looking at the truth of who his mother was. What do you think you would have done if you'd been in my position? Not at the end, not with Ruth and the attorney and the civil suit, but at that kitchen table in Mr. Burroughs' office, looking at that signature, knowing what it meant. What would you have done in the first 5 minutes? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if you've ever felt like someone looked at your grief and saw an opportunity, if you've ever been underestimated by people who should have known better, please subscribe. There's a new story every week, and I promise you, you are not alone in this. Take care of yourself. Hold close the people who actually see you.